everybody. So today is a little bit different. A few people have been asking about doing some calibration work with the spike prime with the overall goal of trying to increase the accuracy of the color sensor. So the color sensor is fairly accurate. I'm going out on a limb here, and I'm going to say I do prefer the EV3 color sensor to the spike. It's probably the main thing that I do miss is the clarity of the EV3 color sensor, and I think it's got a lot to do with how bright the LED is on this color sensor. It makes it a little bit difficult at times, especially if we're trying to get close to the board, because the LED just makes the readings go through the roof. So what we're going to try and do is, how do we streamline those readings a little bit? How do we increase the overall scope of the color sensor to be able to give it more options, especially when it comes to doing some more advanced line follow, leaning into some of the proportional, maybe proportional and derivative type line followers we'll be doing for things like first Lego League or WRO. The other thing I was going to go through is, how do we do this in a smarter way? So how do we actually let the robot do a lot of the thinking and a lot of this presetting of variables by itself, and how do we turn that into an automated system or an automated process that can be used as like a little subroutine before we actually start line following? So with some other products on the market, they've actually got this built into the system itself, so being able to do these calibrations straight off the bat. So the new MBot has it on its quad RGB sensor. You can just double tap a little button and then simply push the robot across the line. It will automatically calibrate the variables and all of the sensors there for you. So what we're going to do though is start to go through the process for this one here. What I'm going to do first though is bore you. I'm actually going to come in here. And something that I like to do with my kids is, especially when they're starting to look at how they're going to code a solution for a problem, is how would you explain it to a person? And that's where they generally start to and ah about what it is they exactly want them to be asking. And a lot of them will say at the end of it, when they've had a session with the robot, or the robot wasn't doing what it was told. And a lot of that comes back to the fact that we haven't potentially asked it or told it exactly what we want. So if we come back and think about what we're wanting to do here, is we're wanting the robot to give us the, let's just say, the perfect values for following a line. And I'm just going to go through here and elaborate on that now a little bit further, as if we use what we would probably see a lot more in classrooms now. We broke this down from a computational thinking perspective. This is our problem. What are the parts of this? And if I highlight the key words in this is a really simple sentence, obviously, and this is probably what I expect the kids to be writing here as well. If we come back to the idea of the robot is going to give us, if I just highlight the word give there, and I'll put it in red, and over here we've got the perfect values. I'm just going to give that a different color code over here. I'm just going to maybe color code that blue for now. And then for following a line, let's just do that in green, for example. So if we broke this down now into how we could potentially tackle this problem, so obviously the robot isn't going to change. It's a standard thing that we're going to have all the way through this problem. The idea of a robot giving us something, so if we translate that back into something the robot can understand, so what does it have that it can give us? So we've got sensor readings, and they are going to be coming from the color sensor. And for it to be able to give that to us, it needs to be able to actively move as well. So I'm just going to put in there too, for it to be able to give, it needs to be actively driving. And we're going to get it to drive across a line. And the reason for that is we're going to get it to pick up not only the white values, but the black values as well. So if I just wrote the word give up here, I'm just going to put this next bit that we had, perfect values. Well, what are perfect values? If we think of the spike sensor coming direct from factory, most of them now, from what I've seen, around that white mark, they are always around that 99%. So they're fairly accurate for the white, given again, because that LED is incredibly bright. The issue that most of them are facing then is where they sit around the darker lines. So if it's a darker red, a darker green, or black, for example, some of them are varying, and then obviously depending on the height of the color sensor, what we're actually seeing is those black values are actually increasing as the students lower the color sensor. So if you've got senior students that are moving from the EV3, they're used to the fact there was a little bit of a little bit more consistency there, I suppose, with where the heights were at. If they're lowering their color sensor down, what they're going to end up noticing is the closer they end up getting to the board or to the line that they're following, those black values are actually going to get higher. And it's something that they're not used to. So how do we actually get these perfect values? Obviously, a perfect value for black would be 0. And a perfect value for white would be 100. And the reason for that is obviously there is a huge scope and scale to those two numbers. We now have 100 potential different values that we could use to be able to code a proportional line follower. It's now got 100 different turns that it possibly could mix together to be able to create a solution as it's driving along. The alternative to that is then looking at if we just did a base value of here. So for example, we had a value of 18 and a value of 99. Already we've lost 19 different varieties of turns. So when we come back to perfect values, when we talk about it, we're going to be trying to get this robot to see black as completely 0, and it's going to be seeing white as 100% white. So we're hopefully going to be able to gain back 19, just in that example, 19 potential extra scenarios for turning. Following a line, I'm just going to show you a really basic single line follow today that is probably the most robust for doing a hard 90-degree turns. So this is a single color sensor that can turn, well, I've done even up to 75%, 80% degree angles for lines, and it's still able to follow that line as it goes. So I'll do a quick example of that. It is a slow one. It's useful when you've got really over-exaggerated lines. They're not smooth by any means. They're designed there to be able to challenge students, so it's something that we can go through as we go through. So where to tackle this first and where to come back here. So we've got the idea of the first part of computational thinking. We're obviously doing some decomposition now. We've broken down the problem. We've come up with the fact that we're going to do a few different things here. There's 3 different problems that we need to be able to do. If we look at abstraction now and we start to look at things that we will potentially need and things that we will have available to us, and what is the information that's important? So sensor readings. Well, what does it currently see? So if I come down here and tap across, so out of the box, what is its reading for white and black? We need to know what motor ports that we have available to be able to drive the robot, to be able to do this first part as well. So we need to know some of this information. We need to make sure that we have this before we go any further. And that should allow us to be able to give. What happens if, when we start to drive our robot, that these readings change? If we're just taking static readings, or a reading that is simply from when the robot is standing still, they aren't current readings. Their readings should be being updated as they drive. So what we're going to say here now is we are going to have a variable, and that variable will change over time. And we only want it to change when these current readings change. So if there is a brighter white, well, we want to know about it. If there's a darker black, well, again, we want to know about it. And we're going to store those information in some variables, and they will change over time as the robot is driving. So there's a few things here for abstraction that we really, really need to understand and we need to include, so we can then actually start to build an algorithm based on these ideas. Obviously, for obtaining this perfect value for the color sensor itself, well, we need to do some maths in here. We need to know how can we actually create this scale of 0 to 100. We need to know what the current sensor readings are as well, and that's where this potentially can actually assist us with this problem as well. And we can use the information or the data that we collect in this first scenario, this first problem, and that solution then can come on to be able to perfect this one. And then realistically, once we have these two problems solved, we should be able to do this problem really easily. So if we come back to this first part here now, and we actually start to think about, well, what do we need to do here? So the robot is going to give us perfect values for following a line. We're saying that it's going to drive. So let's just turn this into a more complex sentence now. The robot is going to drive over a line, and I would even push the students here to tell me, well, how? And I know it's not an English lesson, but the realistic thing is, if we're asking this robot to do it and we want it to do it perfectly, well, we need to actually tell it how to do it perfectly. So the robot is going to drive slowly because we want it to make sure that it's actually getting these readings and it's having time to be able to process these things. The robot is going to drive slowly over a line. While it is driving, it is going to be collecting data from the color sensors. In just this case, it's a singular one, which this could definitely be done with two as well. While it is driving, it is going to be collecting data from the color sensor and storing this information within a variable so it can be used later within an algorithm. So if we come back to turning this particular simple statement now into an actual thing that the robot will do, the robot is going to drive slowly over a line. While it is driving, it's going to be collecting data from the color sensor and storing this information within a variable so it can be used later within an algorithm. That would be a really, really good starting sentence, and that would be something that I would expect to, and I keep coming back to for my kids, the idea of there's a user's version of the code and then there's a solutions focused version of the code. So this is more a user's version of the code. It's easy to understand. It's really, really succinct. Well, probably not as succinct as this, obviously, but it's a lot more elaborate in the sense that it's telling us exactly what it is going to do. If we think about a solutions-focused version of this instructional thing now, the robot is going to drive slowly. Well, what is slowly in the robot's terms? And we're just going to say here 10% speed. While it is driving, it's going to be collecting data. Well, what data specifically? The data specifically is going to be the reflected light intensity. And it's collecting that from the color sensor. It's going to store this information within a variable. Well, we need two variables. We need black and white, so it can be used later within an algorithm. So that means now, so for example, if we were just starting to walk into Python, the idea of global variables and then variables that are targeted within a specific function or something else that's quite smaller. Obviously in Scratch we're just talking global, so these global variables are going to be used later into an algorithm, and that algorithm is just going to be the line follow algorithm. Done. Okay, so if I come back here again and just highlight the things that we need to do now from a solutions focused perspective, . what we've realistically just done is actually written code from a sentence. We're going to put in a drive block that drives at 10% speed. We're going to collect information using the reflected light intensity blocks. We're going to create two variables called black and white, and then later on those black and white parts are going to be used within a line follow algorithm. So we've taken a simple sentence, started to really think about what it is that is actually a problem within that sentence, and then turn it into a more elaborate understanding of the overall problem, used abstraction to be able to use the things that we want to keep and understand, and then from that we've been able to start to work towards actually creating a very, very basic pseudocode for an algorithm that we can potentially go and look at now. We'll move into here in a little bit once we've got this first part started. So if we come back to where we are now, and we'll just jump into Spike. So this is the new version 3 of the software. Having a little bit of issues with it in classrooms at the moment, but it will be interesting to see. It's typically the way when I start doing a recording, we get some of them coming out, so it's helpful. So I'm just going to jump into a new project, and obviously we're using word blocks. And if we come back to our simple sentence, we've got the give and perfect values, our more elaborate one now. Obviously, to drive slowly, we need to know what movement motors we have. So let's just go through this. So if I connect up to this robot here, I'll just turn it on. And I'll just use Bluetooth to do the connection. Interesting name for that one there, but yep. And let's just go through some port planning. So if I look at the ports that I've got in this, the first thing I'm just going to do is come up here into the hub part. I just did that then, and I'm going to change the color sensor, which is currently in F, and at the moment it's reading color values, and I'm going to change it to reflected light intensity, because part of our solution was that we were collecting data from the color sensor to do with reflected light. So if we look at first off, and that was a pretty good indication there straight away of what we had, we're seeing now with the robot where it is positioned, again the lighting here is not very good. I've got an LED overhead, but if we put it down you can start to see some shadows that are coming through. It's reading 99 on white, and it is reading 23 on the black. So that's quite a difference. Yeah, so if we move that along that line, this paper is a little bit rough as well. But again, what we're trying to do now is create a scenario. Well, it should work in these unperfect situations. So if we come back up here, yeah, so 16, 17. So if we were to take it off static readings, we could just take it now. For what we want to do though, we want this to actually run by itself. So first and foremost, I'm just going to set my movement motors to A and B. Something I like the kids to do before they do all this sort of stuff now is just make sure, is the robot actually still driving straight? So if I just press play now, I want to see that it is going to drive in a forward direction. Yeah, I can see there from the wheels, and I can get rid of that now. A quick little scenario and a quick little fix for that, if it is driving in reverse, I just get the kids to click on the A and swap the motors around, and that generally is a really simple fix for it driving backwards and forwards. Alright, so we've got here set movement motors to A and B. We said that we want it to drive slowly, so we're just going to drag here the movement speed over, and I'm just going to set it to let's say 10 to 15%. We'll try 10 and see how that goes, and all we're going to do now is tell the robot to start driving in a straight line. Okay, and we are going to do the next part. So we've just done this first part, tick. We've got it to drive at 10% speed. While it's driving, it's going to be collecting data from the reflected light intensity. So we changed it to reflected light intensity, and we're going to use that block now. And we're going to store this information within a variable called black and white. So what I'm going to do is jump back in here. I'm going to come down to variables. and I'm going to make a variable called black, and I'm going to make a variable called white. And all I'm going to do now is drag over two of the set blocks, and one is going to be white and one is going to be black. And to start the data collection, we're simply going to get it to take a sample of what it is doing or what it sees when it starts up. So if I come into here, I can see all the color sensor blocks. The one that we're chasing is just reflected light and reflected light. So it's going to take the first value it sees, and it's going to store that in the variable for black and white. What I wanted to do here now is I want to give it a sampling rate or a sampling time that it's going to collect this data over. So what I'm going to say is I'm just going to tell it to repeat until, and I'm just going to use a timer in this to be able to create a sampling rate. So I'm just going to say in here, where are we, sensors, and I'm just going to come down here to use a timer, and I'm just going to say before we actually start the loop, I want to reset the timer, and we're going to use the timer now to do a greater than. So if I come back up and drop the timer in, and I'm just going to get this robot to drive forward at a very, very slow speed. I'm just going to say I want a sample of potentially 3 to 4 seconds, so just enough for it to drive for a little bit to be able to see if there's any anomalies within the black or the white readings. And what we're going to do now is we're going to start to ask it some questions. We're going to get the robot to answer some questions for us, and those questions are specifically coming back to this black and this white. If we come back to the understanding of what we're trying to read here now, so we want to collect data. So we want to collect this reflected light intensity data, and while it is doing that, it's going to be storing the information within the variable block. If we say here, while it is driving, I'm just going to put in here now that additional information. So while it is driving for, let's just say 4 seconds, and we'll tick that one off, it is going to be collecting data from the reflected light intensity, which we have done now, and we are going to be storing this information within the black and the white. So if we come back to the code, I'm going to use two if blocks here. So the first one is going to be if, and I'm going to have another if underneath it. So I've got two if blocks, and the first one I'm going to have is, does it see anything greater than the, so anything less than the black reading? So if it's driving, and we have already said, so the interesting thing will be if we looked at this color sensor where it collects its first sample at the start, black is actually going to be 99. So what I'm asking it now is, does it see anything less than the current reading? So if we go through and we start to look at what that potentially means is, if we bring black down in here now as our variable, and we're going to just duplicate one of these reflected light blocks, and what I'm going to say now is, if the reflected light intensity that's being recorded by the color sensor is less than black, well, we're actually going to get it to store that reading as the new black reading. Okay, so if it sees something lower, it's going to say, oh, hold on, this black reading is actually lower, and this is the reading that we should be using for this. I'm just going to duplicate it again, and we're going to drop it into here. So if the color sensor sees something that is less than the current reading, it's going to set that value as the new reading. And we'll do the exact same thing, but in reverse for the white part of the reading. So if I come down here, we're going to say, does it see anything greater than white? So if it does, so we've got the if it sees something less than, or if it sees something greater than. So obviously where it is starting off now, if it sees something greater than 99, well, the likelihood of that is going to be pretty slim. But so for example, if I started over here and it was potentially in a darker space, and it was seeing 23 and it drove forward, and then suddenly it saw 99, it would then store that information. So depending on where it is on the day, on where you're calibrating your color sensors and what you're trying to do, I'm just going to change this. I've just duplicated that variable again. I'm just going to change that variable then to white. So if it sees something greater than the current setting that is for white, it's going to now store that information as a new value within the variable, and then it's going to move on from there. So after those 4 seconds, I'm just going to get it to simply stop moving. And what I want to see over here in a second, we're just going to get this to run for a little bit so we can see if the values populate up here. And let's just see if the logic within our algorithm is working. If I just get it to drive over, I'll just move this line over so we can see what it's doing. 4 seconds is going to be potentially a pretty long time, so we'll just see what happens here. Great. And we can see over here on the side now, we've now got those values coming through. So over that 4 second period of time, we've got a black reading of 17 that came through and a white reading of 100 that came through. So using that information now, we want the robot to be able to base these calculations on what it is then going to do for its automatic understanding of, well, where does it need to be able to scale those values for one. If we were using a grayscale algorithm where we wanted to try and find the middle ground of these, we could simply do that now by adding in a different variable. So all I'm going to do now is, obviously where black and white meet and they mix, we have gray. And gray is potentially the point where we want our robot to be following, because obviously that's the middle ground between the white and the black line. So if we come down here, I'm just going to tell it to stop, to set, I will put it after the stop, set gray to, and let's just go through some maths here. So if I add these two values together, so if I add the black and the white together, so if I come in here to variables and I have black and I have white, we will get what the two values are in total. And then all I want to do is actually divide them by 2. And that will give me the medium of those two numbers. So if I come in here now, I should be able to, and let's just try it again, it should automatically spit out a new grayscale value for gray. And let's just see what happens. So if I press play, beautiful, it's given us a gray reading of 57.5, and it's done that by itself. So I can now feed that grayscale, or where I want this potential line follower to follow at, I could just set that automatically. This is now its new set point. So for a proportional system, and we are asking it to find a set point, it's now actually calculated its own set point based on the information that it's collected while driving over that short little period of time. So the setup that I'm going to show you though, this is a simple system to use, and it really is effective to be able to use grayscale for line following especially. I want to take it a little bit further for this tutorial to be able to go through and actually start to look at how we can potentially use that information now to be able to create something that's called a mapped reading. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to not only use this information here that we have collected, I'm also going to start building a bit of a line follow program. So once the robot stops after it's done its readings, I'm actually going to get it to do something else. So what I want to do now is I want it to wait until, and we're just going to use one of the buttons on the spike to be able to engage the color, engage this next part of the program. So I'm just going to say wait until the left button is pressed. I might actually give the user a little bit of feedback to say that, hey, that particular part of the calibration program is finished. So I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to say set the power button light to red. And once that red light comes on, we know then this robot is ready to be able to start the next process, which is obviously going to be doing some line following. So all of this original calculation stuff is all finished now. We could even, if we wanted to, we could actually set this subroutine and turn that into, let's just do that anyway. We'll turn that into a my block before we go any further. I'm just going to move this color stuff off to the side, and I'm just going to call this, let's just come down to my blocks, and I'll just call this record readings, and just hit save, and I'll just bring this over here to the right hand side. So what we could actually have is, rather than say when program starts, we could have if, for example, if the left button is pressed, or if the right button is pressed. So what we could have on here now is, so for example, if we said the right button, so I want to keep left all over this side, if we push the right button, it will automatically do the record reading side of it, or the calibration, so to speak, at the start there. And then once it's gone through that process, if we hit the left button, it will then go on to do this next part. So what we could do is actually have a separate, it all depends on exactly how you want to use it. Again, you could have these as separate things that you could have the robot to do. So if you just wanted to line follow, for example, you could just hit the left button and it line followed. If you wanted to redo the values and do a bit of a calibration at the start of before you did a run, you could then hit the right button and then automatically go into the next part or next phase. So what we're going to do is record readings, set the red icon light on the robot itself, and then from there we're going to come back and start to go through a process for developing this algorithm for doing some line following. What I want to do now is create another variable, and we've got a few here now, and I'm just going to do a very, very simple proportional line follower here. So this is super simple, but this one is more for those really, really tricky courses where speed isn't necessarily the best answer. It's what is the best answer for like really, really tight turns, almost beyond hairpin right turns. This will always give you the perfect response to those. What we're going to do is we're going to come into variables. There's a few that I want to do. So I want to do the first one being that we're going to map the light values, or the reflected light intensity. So we're going to map reflected, and I'm just going to bring that down into here for now. I'll grab a map reflected, and I'm just going to set all these variables to 0 at the start of this next process, just so we have a bit of continuity between saved values from the last one. I'm just going to save in here the error as well. Being a proportional system, obviously we've got our set target that we want, but we're going to actually set that perfectly now at 50, because we want it to scale between 0 and 100 for those two numbers. So the next one is just setting a left motive power. And actually in this one I'm going to use speed. There's been some sort of major improvements for speed, so we'll just talk about that in a little bit, but I'm just going to say left motor and then obviously right motor as our variables. So we've got a few variables, but we'll come back. I just go through the simple process. I know not everyone does this, but I always make sure that I am asking students to make all those variables null and clean before they start a program, and generally it is a foolproof method for debugging at the best of times. What we're going to do now, we're going to go through and talk about this scaling system that we're going to use. So there's a few things in here. I need to know what the difference is between the the white reading and the black reading. I need to know what the scale and the scope of that is at the moment. So if we come back to the idea of what we've collected for information now. So we've collected that over here where we have the white reading and the black reading. So what I want to do now when I look at making this mapped value, so I'm just going to grab my variable. I'm going to bring over another one now. I'm going to go to mapped, and it's going to say map reflected. So what I want to do, I need to ask it a few more questions, and it's going to keep doing this as it goes. So I'm going to need a reflected light intensity block to measure the readings that it is currently getting. I'm going to need a takeaway, and I'm also going to have another takeaway in here as well. In this side of this particular takeaway, we are going to put in the white reading values, and because we've already collected them, we're not going to put any numbers in there. We are simply going to allow this algorithm to do all of this thinking process for us. So in the left hand side is going to be the white reading. In the right hand side, we're going to put the black reading, and it will be the same reading over here on this right hand side as well. So what we're trying to figure out is where is it in position to, obviously knowing the difference between these two numbers, well, where is it currently in relation to the black as well? And then what we're going to do is we're going to divide them by each other. And when we divide them by each other, we're going to work out what it is that is the difference between them. And that math, we're going to quickly bring over here and show that as an example in a second. But the last part of that is I want to bring it back into a scale of 100. And the reason why bringing it back into a scale of 100 is obviously we can't have anything more than 100% with this color sensor. So when we come back to scale it, I want to turn whatever reading that it is getting into a scale of 100. So if I just pull that out of the way, and I'm just going to put in here times by 100. So this is the algorithm, or this is the mathematics now to actually be able to do this mapping. And this mapping is going to happen real time as the robot is running. So if we move on to the next part, which is obviously starting to do a little bit of line following using this algorithm that we've just created to be able to map the reflected light intensity, what we're going to do is start to build some of the code that is useful in relation to that as well. So up here we started to go through all the variables. Obviously we've done the map reflected part of that now. So what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next one, which is the error. So in the error, we're just going to drop another set block down and come into error. And the error is going to be calculated based on this reflected light reading that is now being recalculated, being taken away from a set point. And earlier I showed how we would find the grayscale set point, and with this particular algorithm here we are scaling those light values between 0 and 100. So the middle of that is going to be easy for us to find, which is 50. So all we're going to do is grab a minus up here, and depending on the side of the line that you want to follow, and this is an easy thing to be able to change that, it's just by simply putting the target on either side. So we want to follow on the outside of the line, so I'm just going to put it here, and I'm going to say minus 50, sorry, and I'm going to come over here to variables and grab the map reflected, and that is now going to find our difference between the reading that it's calculating through doing the mapping minus our set point, or where we want it to sit, which is that gray point, and we know that gray point will be 50. So from here we need to actually feed this error into our motors, and what we're going to do is we're going to use a scaling factor in here as well. So what I want to do is I'm going to bring down our set, and I'm going to bring down 2 of them, and I'm just going to have left motor and right motor. Our left motor is going to have a takeaway, And our right motor is going to have one as well. And to add in that scaling factor or the proportional part of our line follow algorithm, we're going to have two multiplications here as well. And that's something that we can work out in a little bit as to what those scaling factors might be. So on this left hand side, I'm going to say 100. And 100 is our white reading, and we know that that's exactly the perfect reading for white. And what I'm going to put in the other side there now is our error. So based on what our map reflected light intensity has worked out, and then taking that away from the set point, we're going to work out what it is that we're going to be able to set our speed to. So if I come into here, I'm now going to put those two numbers together. So for example, if our robot was traveling along, if it was perfectly on the position, so if it was reading 50 and the color sensor scale came back at 50 and then we're saying minus 50, well obviously the difference is 0. So in here for a speed, it's going to be 100 minus 0, which is going to give us 100% motor power, which is just pretty full on for a line follow. So what we're going to do is we're going to scale that back. So all I'm going to say for here now is we might start with 0.3 to start off with, and we're just going to feed that back into our left motor power. On the other side now, we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm just going to steal this error block. On the other side of this now, we're also going to have in on this side what it is that is our black reading. So I'm just going to put in here 0. And the same thing it will be for our scaling factor of that as well. So if we have our error coming through for the reflected light reading, and we'll go through and work out the left and right for based on those numbers. So what we'll do here now is jump into our extension blocks, and we'll just show you where we got them from. So I typically always use both of these whenever I'm doing a build. So this one's the more movement block, and this one has in it specifically this one here. And what we have is we have the two motors both being hooked up to speed, and we can put those values into those ones there as well. So what I want to do is I'm going to jump into our variables, left motor and right motor. Before we go on to looking at actually running the robot, what I want to have a look at is what can we see from some of the sensor feedback that we're getting in regards to some of these numbers. Obviously for power it needs to come through at an integer, which is, no, it doesn't have any decimal places. It needs to be a whole number. So if we look at some of the feedback we're getting for some of these numbers over here, so if I just push play again, we do our calibration once more. Beautiful. Our black is 26, which is interesting, and then our white is 99. But if we do a line follow now, what I want to see is what is that data changing to. I'm going to stop it there. So we've got a lot of decimals coming through. So if we just look at the left motor, and the map reflected has just gone off the charts for the amount of remaining decimals in that side of there. But what I want to do is potentially get rid of the decimals. And how do I do that? Well, let's have a look at rounding. So if we come down the bottom here, can we round a number? And for example, let's round our motor value as the final thing in the algorithm to see if what we feed into these motors can change. So let's just press play again. I might just do another calibration considering those high numbers. Yep, And it might be because we've changed the light and I've moved on to this bigger board up on the table. I'll just put the camera up here as well. And let's have a look at what we're doing. So we've just calibrated again. I'm just going to hit the left button now to do a bit of a line follow. Fantastic. It's taking that right angle really smoothly, so bit of a challenging course for this one here now. Let's just put it on this other side and see how it goes. Yep, so able to take those right angles as well really easily. So what we've got now is some fairly rounded values that we can go through. If we wanted to track the actual variable, we'd need to move the rounding up higher, but for the sake of this, let's just do that so we can see in the variables tab what's actually happening. If we round the overall amount and bring that back in for the left and right, we will take it out of, let's just take it out of here now, because we're going to do it twice then. And let's round this one here as well. And bring our left and right back in. And let's just see now, if I just bring this up, what we can do now is actually turn this into a my block to make our lives a little bit easier. So I'm just going to come up here and say line follow. And just click save. And I'll just drop that onto there so we can move it down out of the way. Alright, and let's just put line follow here, which is in that sequence of not only doing the calibration but also the other stuff that's coming through to do it one after the other. But we can also put line follow over here, where if we just press play, we should just be able to hit the left button now and it will follow using the previous stored variables. So what we can see now for our motor speeds, they're coming through, they're rounding. And we've got some nice stable numbers that are coming through for them. A lot easier for the robot to process as raw speeds. Fantastic. So that's working really, really well, especially on quite a challenging course. Beautiful. Alright, there we go. So what we've been able to do, create our recordings, have the robot actually go and do that all by itself, so doing that autonomously using that process there, coming into our line following using a mapping algorithm to be able to work out the scale of 0 to 100, and then using a simple proportional line follower, using some more of the math blocks in there with the rounding, and then just feeding that into the new newly calibrated speed blocks which have come with that with version 3 as well, which have been really stable. So they're actually performing really well in comparison to the power blocks as well. So typically before it would have been really difficult to do a line follow, especially something that's as responsive as this to that right angle with the previous blocks. So that's doing that really well. Alright, we'll leave it there. I'll let you have a bit of a play with that. If you've got any questions, feel free to reach out.